He thought his past was buried beneath the silence of years he never spoke of, sealed behind locked memories and the long-forgotten roars of distant arenas. But all it took was a single phone call to rip the grave open and drag him back into the fight. The voice on the other end was strained, official, and cold. A child. Orphaned. The son of someone Chuck Norris once knew like a brother and battled like an enemy. Someone who once stood toe-to-toe with him in tournaments that reeked of blood, sweat, and vengeance. A man named Marcus Young. They had shared the mat, the victories, the betrayals, and once, just once, something that felt like friendship. But years had passed since then. Marcus had disappeared into the shadows, vanished from the spotlight, tangled himself in secrets and enemies that Chuck had no interest in chasing. Until now. Until Marcus was dead. Killed in a car explosion that wasn't an accident. Chuck didn't need more details. He could smell the signature of violence, the stench of unfinished wars disguised as coincidences. And the child, Jacob, was just 10. Fragile. Innocent. And hunted. That last word hit Chuck harder than he expected. Not because of the danger, but because of the unspoken code he still lived by. You don't leave a child defenseless, especially when that child is tied to a man you once called your rival, especially when your gut screams that the past isn't done with you yet. Chuck flew out the same night. No press. No security detail. No entourage. Just him, a single bag, and the weight of promises he never made aloud but always honored in silence. The orphanage in Phoenix was small, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and rusted gates, but its isolation hadn't kept the shadows away. The staff told Chuck the boy hadn't spoken since the funeral. He only stared out the window, clutching a faded photo of his father in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. Chuck entered the room with measured steps, not as a celebrity, not as a legend, but as a man stepping into a battlefield built not from fists but from trauma and silence. Jacob looked up slowly, his eyes hollow, but somewhere deep inside them, recognition. Not of fame. Of something else. Maybe aura. Maybe instinct. Maybe fate. Chuck knelt beside him and extended a hand. Jacob didn't take it. He just unfolded the paper and handed it over. A map. Scribbled hastily. At the bottom, 2 words. Help him. It was Marcus's handwriting. Slanted. Sharp. The kind you remember even after decades. Chuck's jaw clenched. His heart didn't race, he'd trained that out of himself years ago, but something inside him shifted. He was being pulled into something deeper than a favor. This was a calling. The next day, the first shot came. Not metaphorical. A real bullet aimed at Jacob's chest while he played in the courtyard. Chuck was faster. Always had been. He tackled the boy to the ground, rolled behind a stone bench, and scanned the tree line. 1 shooter. Professional. Silencer. Retreat strategy. Chuck's instincts kicked in like old gears in a rebuilt engine. He memorized the shooter's gait, height, the slight limp on the left foot, and the logo on the rifle strap, an old symbol. One he hadn't seen since Bangkok, 1987. The Black Tide. A mercenary group Marcus once fought against. Or with. It had never been clear. What mattered now was that they were back, and they wanted the boy gone. Chuck moved Jacob that night. Packed their things in under 5 minutes and burned everything they left behind. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Jacob followed. Still silent, still pale, but his eyes never left Chuck's back. There was trust now. Unspoken, fragile, but real. They drove through the desert like ghosts avoiding the living. Chuck changed plates at every gas station. Wore sunglasses in the dead of night. Slept in abandoned cabins and roadside motels so forgotten that even GPS refused to acknowledge them. Along the way, Chuck began piecing it together. Marcus hadn't just vanished. He'd gone undercover. Deep. Disappeared into the underworld to dismantle something from the inside. Something big. And he'd left behind evidence. Names. Numbers. Locations. Hidden in bits and pieces, scattered across safe houses only a few people still knew about. Chuck was one of them. Not by choice, but because years ago, before the final split, Marcus had entrusted him with a key. Literally. A brass key mailed without explanation. Chuck had kept it. Not because he wanted to, but because something told him it wasn't over. He was right. The first safe house was in El Paso. A crumbling dojo that once trained champions now housed silence and broken windows. Inside, Chuck found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, guarded by a combination lock that took him 5 seconds to crack. Muscle memory. Inside, a flash drive, a burner phone, and a worn leather journal. The journal was coded, but Chuck could read between the lines. Every entry pointed to a deeper conspiracy, a network of corrupted officials and ex-operatives with vendettas stretching back decades. And at the center of it all, Project Red Cinder. A name that meant nothing to the world, but everything to the people Marcus had tried to destroy. Jacob's father had gotten too close, and now they wanted to erase every trace of him, including his blood. Chuck didn't flinch. He made a decision right there on the warped floor of a forgotten dojo. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He would confront the past and finish what Marcus started. Because that boy deserved a future not haunted by ghosts. Because some debts are repaid with action, not words. Because he was Chuck Norris. And they had come after the wrong child. They moved east. Louisiana. Tennessee. Virginia. Following a trail of burned-out safe houses and encrypted messages hidden in places only someone from their era could understand. Meanwhile, Jacob started to change. He still didn't speak. But he watched. Learned. He began mimicking Chuck's movements. The way he scanned a room. The way he timed his breathing before entering unknown spaces. It wasn't play. It was survival. He had seen too much. Lost too much. But in Chuck, he saw an anchor. Someone who didn't panic. Didn't flinch. Didn't abandon. In a hotel outside Richmond, Chuck was ambushed. 3 men. Tactical gear. Suppressors. Military precision. But they underestimated him. Everyone always did. Chuck dismantled them in 23 seconds without firing a single shot. The boy saw everything. Chuck hadn't wanted that. But there was no other way now. After the fight, Jacob handed Chuck a pen and wrote a single word on a napkin. Teach. Chuck stared at the word. For a moment, everything went still. Time didn't stop, it just slowed. He nodded once. From that day forward, Jacob became his student. Not in flashy kicks or flying punches, but in awareness. Control. Balance. How to see before being seen. How to act without hesitation. How to understand that strength isn't about hurting. It's about protecting. It was never about glory. It was about purpose. Chuck knew that now more than ever. And every day, Jacob took one step closer to becoming someone who could survive the world that had tried to erase him. But the world didn't stop chasing. The black tide escalated. They burned down safe houses. Interrogated old contacts. Their reach extended into places even Chuck had forgotten existed. And they weren't just looking for the boy anymore. They were hunting Chuck. The message was clear: old debts come due. In Philadelphia, a name surfaced. Anton Durrell. Former CIA. Now mercenary overlord. One of Marcus's last known associates. If anyone had answers, it was him. Chuck knew the risks. Durrell wasn't just dangerous. He was vindictive. He held grudges like medals. But Chuck didn't hesitate. He left Jacob with a trusted friend in upstate New York, an old army buddy with a farm and a loaded shotgun, and went south. Alone. The confrontation with Durrell wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. Tense. In a cigar smoke-filled room of a private club where secrets bought more power than bullets. Chuck didn't waste time. He asked about Project Red Cinder. Durrell laughed. Said it was dead. Said Marcus had died for nothing. But Chuck knew a lie when he heard one. So he waited. Watched. Listened. And when Durrell slipped, when he mentioned a location he wasn't supposed to know, Chuck leaned in and smiled. 2 days later, that location burned to the ground. But not before Chuck retrieved what he came for. A second flash drive. More names. More proof. More enemies. He sent the data to a trusted journalist. One with a reputation for truth and a spine of steel. Let the world deal with the fallout. Chuck had other priorities now. Because the minute he stepped off the train back into New York, he knew something was wrong. The farm was too quiet. The silence was wrong. Heavy. When he burst through the door, he found blood. Signs of struggle. And a missing boy. The black tide had found them. Chuck stood in the wreckage of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning every splintered beam, every drop of dried blood, every clue left behind by professionals who thought they were ghosts. But they didn't cover their tracks well enough. Not for him. He could see the pattern in the broken lamp, in the dragged boot prints across the hardwood floor, in the scattering of tools they didn't take. The boy had fought back. That mattered. Not because it changed anything, but because it meant he hadn't given up. Jacob was still in the fight. That was all Chuck needed. The next 48 hours were a storm. He didn't sleep. Didn't eat. He chased down leads through alleyways and safe houses, across rooftops and underworld circles where his name still carried weight. Every old enemy who thought he was done found themselves face to face with the version of Chuck they hoped they'd never meet again. The version that didn't miss. The version that didn't negotiate. And finally, a whisper. An abandoned estate in northern Vermont. Remote. Fortified. Guarded. The kind of place you don't find unless someone wants you to. Chuck found it anyway. He hiked in through a blizzard, dressed in black, heart calm, hands steady. As he approached the perimeter, he counted 12 guards. All armed. All alert. None ready. He moved like wind between trees. Silent. Invisible. The first 2 went down without a sound. The third tried to scream, but the snow swallowed the noise. By the time the 5th dropped, the rest knew he was there. But it didn't matter. The storm had come, and it wore boots. Inside the estate, Jacob was locked in a reinforced room, eyes red, body bruised, but alive. And when Chuck burst through that steel door, the boy didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He just looked at him and nodded once. That nod cut deeper than any thank you ever could. But the mission wasn't over. Alarms rang. Lights blazed. Chuck lifted Jacob into his arms, retraced his path through chaos, and emerged from the estate just as the sky turned blood red from the flames behind them. He hadn't started the fire. But he didn't put it out either. Some places need to burn. For a few weeks after, they vanished. The media called it a rescue. A miracle. The headlines spoke of heroism, of a ghost warrior emerging from nowhere. But Chuck didn't read them. He kept Jacob close, taught him how to disappear, how to survive, how to think. And slowly, the boy began to heal. Not completely. That never happens. But enough to begin again. Chuck knew they couldn't keep running forever. So he made a choice. One final move. One confrontation that would end it. Not just for Jacob. But for everyone. The black tide had a leader. Not Durrell. Not the Mercs. Someone higher. Someone Chuck had hoped never to see again. Viktor Malenko. The same man who had once trained with Marcus in Russia. The same man who'd been expelled from the underground tournaments for breaking a fighter's spine mid-match and laughing about it. A ghost who had become a myth. And then a myth who built an empire. Chuck tracked him to a private island off the coast of Maine. Hidden in plain sight. Armed to the teeth. The kind of place people don't leave. Chuck didn't plan on leaving either. He brought Jacob to a secure facility in D.C. under the watch of people who owed him more than one favor. The boy didn't want him to go. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said enough. But Chuck had made peace with what had to be done. He got on a boat at midnight alone. No weapons. Just a steel case strapped to his back and the weight of a promise made in silence. The island was everything he expected. Concrete walls. Turrets. trained killers. But none of them knew what it meant to face someone who'd spent his whole life preparing to die for the right cause. Chuck walked through the front gates and waited. They came in waves. He dismantled them like paper men. Not because he was faster. Not because he was stronger. But because he had something none of them did: purpose. And it burned hotter than fear. When he finally stood before Victor, the room smelled of sweat and gunpowder. Victor looked older. But not weaker. His presence still filled the space like smoke. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. 2 men. 2 legacies. 1 truth. The fight was brutal. No flash. No crowd. Just flesh and will and history colliding in a room built for war. Chuck took hits that would shatter bone. But he didn't break. Victor fought like a man with nothing to lose. Chuck fought like a man who already had. In the final moment, when Victor lunged with a blade drawn from his boot, Chuck stepped aside, twisted his wrist, and drove the man into the wall with a force born from decades of restraint. And when Victor slumped to the floor, coughing blood, Chuck knelt beside him. He didn't speak vengeance. He didn't speak forgiveness. He just looked him in the eye and said, "It ends now." And it did. The authorities arrived hours later. The compound was seized. Files uncovered. Names exposed. The black tide fell like dominoes. Chuck didn't wait for applause. He didn't want it. He disappeared again. Weeks passed before Jacob saw him. But when he did, the boy didn't just smile, he ran. For the first time, he laughed. Not because everything was fixed, but because something inside had finally healed. Chuck stayed close after that. Not hovering. Just present. Like a lighthouse. He trained with Jacob every morning. Taught him discipline, focus, calm. They never spoke much about the past. But sometimes, in the quiet between movements, Jacob would ask questions. About his father. About the tournaments. About what it meant to fight without hate. Chuck always answered. Not with glory. With truth. Jacob listened. Learned. Became. Years passed. The boy grew. Strong. Balanced. Thoughtful. He never entered the ring. He didn't need to. His battles had already been fought. His victories already earned. And Chuck, the man who once thought his past was buried, found peace not in the silence of forgetting, but in the quiet legacy of protection. The past had come calling. But it hadn't broken him. It had given him purpose. And somewhere, deep in the shadows where monsters once hunted, a single flame still burned. Not for revenge. For redemption. Because in the end, it wasn't about being a legend. It was about being there when someone needed him most. No spotlight. No cameras. Just a boy who needed saving. And a man who refused to let him fall.